the open doorway of the ancient weathered log cabin, far up the slopes of Sugarloaf Mountain, stood a rugged mountain man with a stout frame, clad in typical overalls attire. Thomas Edward Justice, simply known in the little world of Edneyville as Big Tom. Now, Tom was innocent of all book learning and void of any license to operate a business in the state of North Carolina. But the Hill folks knew that they could count on him at the farmer's market every Saturday for a wagon load of fresh vegetables. It had been that way for the past 20 years, as Big Tom peddled his Irish taters, corn, and apples. Depending on the time of year, he might even have some fresh strawberries or chestnuts. But one thing's for sure, he'd be at that market with something to sell each and every week. Today was a busy day for Big Tom since it was Friday. There was so much to do. He took note of the fresh new buds springing to life on the maple trees. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Indeed, the weather was finally taking a turn for the better. Gone were the long, cold, hard days of winter, and renewed were the hopes of the longer days and bountiful crops to come. With that in mind, Tom wasted no time hooking up the plow to his faithful mule, Earl. "Well, Earl, it's time me and you get back at it, old boy, and start turning this dirt over," he said as he gently rubbed the animal's neck like he was a blood family member. Inside of the primitive cabin, his wife Effie was busy preparing strips of hog in the cast iron kettle while making cornbread on a flat griddle held over the open flame of the fireplace. By now, all the kids were starting to stir, and what a passel of young'uns it was. 7 boys and 4 girls. But the way folks figured back then, you needed a fine crop of young'uns to help ease the workload of taking care of the fields and the animals. And wouldn't you know it, it looked like the Justice family was about to be blessed again by the good Lord, since it was plain for anyone to see that Effie was very pregnant. So much so that they had sent for the granny woman yesterday, because the baby, they were likely to make their grand entrance into this world any minute. Sure enough, by noon that day, the mountain doctor galloped to the Justice homestead with a saddlebag full of the latest medicine that she had harvested from the hills and the hollers. And she wasn't a moment too soon, as Effie was in the full throes of labor. Now, back in those days, babies in the spring were just a natural order of things, and menfolk didn't do all the pacing the floors and fretting and worrying like they do now. No, sir. They went right ahead, tending to their business. So it was no surprise that Big Tom and Earl never broke stride out in the fields, while Effie was giving birth inside the cabin. The farmer looked up and he saw his eldest boy, Tom Jr., running towards him. "Paul, we got a baby girl." The mountaineer gave a brief nod of understanding to his son. Well, how about that? Another gal to help out around the house, he thought to himself. Well, directly, about 30 minutes later, Junior came running across the field again. "Paul, we got another baby girl." Big Tom nodded again and casually thought to himself, "Well, I reckon I'll break ground on a couple more rows this year. The good Lord knows we'll need the extra food." And lo and behold, it weren't nary 15 minutes later when Big Tom looked up and saw his boy running towards the field, yet again, with his arms flailing away. "Paul, there's another one!" "What in tarnation is going on in there?" the old man yelled out as he dropped his plow and took off running towards the cabin. He had to make sure there weren't any more gals about to be born today. And so it was. The Justice household was now bursting at the seams, with 7 boys and 7 girls. Now, folks around these parts had heard tales of twins before, but triplets? That was plumb unheard of on Sugarloaf. And by the next day, wagging tongues had spread the news up and down Wolf Creek and clear across Jude's Gap. Over the next week, a steady stream of kinfolks and curious alike visited the Justice homestead to see the famous triplets with their own eyes. When Uncle Bob Freeman first saw the girls, he asked the obvious question, Well, Big Tom, what you gonna name 'em? Well, I don't rightly know. It's hard to tell 'em apart. Uncle Bob pointed at the girl who had been born first and said, "Why don't you name that one there after my wife Bessie? And since they look so much alike, it's only sensible to make their names rhyme. How about Essie, Bessie, and Dessies?" And just like that, the triplets had their legal names. From that moment on, Essie, Bessie, and Dessies were inseparable. Effie made all their clothes and dressed them identical. And as they grew, they were the pride and joy of Big Tom. He took the girls to baby contests down in the valley, where all three of these pretty girls would cause a spectacle rarely seen in the mountains. Folks would come from all over to see the famous Justice girls, and they were showered with all the free ice cream that they could eat each time they went to town. Back home, they worked just like all the other kids. Each girl helped out with the household chores, tending to the animals, and were even paid 10 cents a day to work the potato and the corn fields. A few months out of the year, all the children of Sugarloaf Mountain would attend the Shepherd one-room schoolhouse. It was here that Essie, Bessie, and Dessies were given the nicknames of Boots, Shoes, and Leggins by their classmates. The girls were model children as long as their parents were around, but it was well known that they loved to rip and run just like all their siblings. They got into every bit of mischief possible, climbing trees and fences. But the most fun they had was going to school during the winter. You see, the road they walked had a large overhanging cliff that water cascaded down, which created an icicle wonderland during the cold months. The triplets would battle their brothers and their sisters and their classmates in epic wars with these huge chunks of ice, fiercely fighting as a team. Yet, at the same time, each Sunday, the girls would be on their best behavior in their pretty dresses, sitting between Effie and Big Tom, and even sung in the church choir. The biggest day of the year at the Justice House was the triplets' birthday. It would be planned for months in advance, with the entire community celebrating it with the family. Yes, sir, these were simple times back then, but the Justice Triplets always said that these were some of the best memories of their life. They always had food, and they were surrounded by loving, hard-working parents. Yet, time marches on. By 1920, both Essie and Bessie were 17 years old and married. Dessies soon followed. Just like that, the triplets started out on their own individual journeys. However, the seeds that were planted by their parents during their childhood proved to be lasting for them, and they would go on and live long, healthy lives, running successful businesses, surrounded by a passel of children of their own and scores of grandchildren. Their birthdays continued to be spectacles for the rest of their lives, with newspapers across America celebrating each one. Even President Ronald Reagan would write them to celebrate their special day. Dessies died in 1986 at 82 years old. Bessie followed in 1988 at 84 years old. And by 1998, the last of the triplets, Essie, died at 93 years old. Ironically, the spirit of Essie, Bessie, and Dessies still lives on today. Take a look at this photo from their 80th birthday. You see those babies in their laps? Those are their great-grand-nieces, who are now known as the famous Hinkle triplets. So, my friend, now you know the rest of the story on Essie, Bessie, and Dessies, the famous Justice Triplets of Appalachia. Be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.